Welcome to episode 3 of MONSTROUS. This is the Pretext, and we question whether the whole hoaxed program created by Tortoise Media is premeditated propaganda. Now this time I have attempted to make a supplementary PowerPoint presentation using Keynote on my son's Apple Mac. But as a new user of Mac, I'm finding it all too tricky, and I'm not fully au fait with that. So bear with me as we proceed. First thing to say is that you must proceed with caution. Due to the deeply disturbing nature of the details discussed in this podcast, I urge listeners to proceed carefully. Please seek professional advice and support should the material herein trigger memories or cause you upset. Stop whenever you need to. Think about whether this is something that is going to cause you to recall events that are traumatic and triggering. Okay, so the podcast as a form, it goes without saying, it's relatively new. But it has great potency and potential, and anyone in the media knows this today. For example, you've got things like Joe Rogan, H3H3, Lex Friedman, and many, many others. It is the form to use at the moment, and there are many reasons for this. Generally, in its early days, the podcast was episodic. It was audio rather than visual, and it has evolved over time to become more organic in terms of like a long chat, an interview that includes visuals as well. The wonderful thing about a podcast and why it's so popular is that it just audio means that it's consumable whilst the listener is doing other things, and because we're busy people, going to work, raising children, paying bills, all that we need to do. If we can listen to good quality entertainment or information as we do those things, we like to be stimulated and go forward with that. So it's a very popular form at the moment. One of the most potent things about this podcast form, though, is that it can affect real-world consequences. And I would say that MONSTROUS and the makers of Hoaxed, the podcast, which you can find on Apple Podcasts, or you can go and pay for it at Tortoise Media. I think they are very aware of this potential to affect real-world consequences. The first example of this is Serial. It had 340 million downloads last time I checked. And we say without reservation that Sarah Koenig, the true investigative journalist who created that podcast, or at least narrated it, she created a masterpiece, a masterstroke. It's a testament to her ability as a investigative journalist. It is a stylish, brilliant piece of work that saw Adnan Syed, who had been accused of murdering his high school sweetheart. It saw him released just last year on the 22nd of September 2022. He was in jail for 23 years, and the case was eventually overturned. She did great work in illuminating all the holes in the case and keeping abreast of all the changes. And it was an episodic, very, very fascinating piece-by-piece case scenario that unfolded organically and responded in the moment, really, or in real time, more or less, to listeners who had more information. A little bit like Making a Murderer, but this was audio. So I'm going to use Serial. I've included the link in the in the PowerPoint, or the keynote presentation rather, should you wish to listen to it. I'm going to use it as the comparison. So whenever I'm making a judgment about how good or how poor hoaxed is, I'm going to think of Serial, so that we can make clear judgments and move forward. Another really interesting example of a podcast that affected real world consequences is The Teacher's Pet. It was Australian, and last time I checked it had 60 million downloads, and it was the recipient of the Walkley Award, which is a prestigious journalistic award in Australia, and the link is there as well. So Chris Dawson was a teacher at a Northern Beaches high school in Sydney, and he and his wife lived happily together, it seemed, until they didn't. And he got a babysitter who was one of his students, and his wife disappeared suddenly. There was a lot of conjecture and unknown circumstances around Lynn Dawson's disappearance. And this creation of The Teacher's Pet actually saw Chris Dawson being prosecuted last year as well on the 30th of August for that historic murder. So I don't think MONSTROUS would be in the dark about this, and I think they have chosen the form of the podcast very, very deliberately to affect real-world consequences in the Hampstead Heath case, particularly in light of the fact that the two children at the centre of this case are about to come of age very soon. I've said a number of times I believe it is a preemptive strike against those potential victims. So let's turn now to Tortoise Media, the makers of Hoaxed. It was established in 2019, so really not very long ago. It's only three years young. MONSTROUS is a partner in the company, and he is a former barrister. That is important, that is interesting. He's a legal mind, and he also studied English at Cambridge. Now, I find that very interesting because he does not act in the podcast in a way that shows any understanding of how to explore a text or a range of texts. There are so many texts associated with the Hampstead Heath case, and he doesn't do that justice. He doesn't use textual evidence. He doesn't support his ideas with proper information. He is, however, not very skilled. He is somewhat skilled at launching a persuasive argument, but held up to even the most average minds, you can very quickly start to pick holes in it. I go so far as to suggest that the way he handles text is negligent, particularly for somebody who has been to one of the greatest universities and studied literature there, at Cambridge. He privileges, he silences, and he marginalises, and in some circumstances he completely omits very important evidence, such as document A, which any Tom, Dick or Harry can find. I'll link it here in the description. I'm also recording that at the moment. Part 1 and Part 2 is already up there for the listening, again, because we don't have time to read necessarily. But yeah, he is certainly at odds, I would say, with journalistic principles and literary principles. And that's why I think I might be the right person to unpack what he does and have a debate with him, or at least an interview with MONSTROUS. If you're listening, MONSTROUS, I loved it when you sampled Arthur Cattell's Facebook Live. So I know you're listening, I know you're watching. Please come on and let's discuss our different opinions about the way you handle texts. I've got lots of questions for you, and no doubt you'll have lots of questions for me. Open invitation, MONSTROUS. So they've called themselves Tortoise Media because they claim to be slow but wise. They like long-form style, and I agree with this. I concur. I'm very sad that everything's switching to a short form. TikTok, Snapchat, Twitter, these are very condensed forms. It's a sign of the times. But Tortoise Media is going against that grain and trying to do the long form style, revert back to that longer, more seemingly investigative, in-depth journalism. Now, interestingly, there has been a little bit of a renaissance in the long form. Things like Joe Rogan, Lex Friedman, H3H3, they do go for many hours sometimes. My alarm's going off. I apologise. I've got to turn it off. Okay, that's gone. So before Tortoise, Monstrous, interestingly, he worked for the Times and the Guardian. Now, these are major status quo media operatives, or operations, let's say. We once thought that they had a good reputation, but we know now that the Times and the Guardian, all they do is seek to uphold the status quo, and their mouthpieces really for the ruling elite. So Alexei Monstrous, despite really trying very hard in the marketing material for Tortoise Media, he really is a media darling. He's a darling of the media. That's where he's worked, the Times, the Guardian, and that'll come into play later. I would say personally that he's not a great journalist. He might be a good barrister. He's good at launching an argument, I would say, for, as I say, an average mind. Your average idiot that's just going to accept everything that's told to them. Not idiot. I don't mean that. That sounds awful. But his writing in Hoaxed, I would say, is very poor. Very, very poor. It, in fact, makes me squeamish at times. It's so bad. And yet, there are some really effective pieces of writing on the Tortoise Media website, but they're never written by Monstrous. They're written by another partner, and they're quite clever. However, I won't digress into that. You can look that up yourself. The next thing I wanted to move to was what I call the setup. So the setup show for Tortoise Media was Sweet Bobby. It attempts to deal with what is quite an intriguing premise of a young Indian English woman who, has this relationship with a mysterious person who keeps spinning yarns. The precursor to this type of true crime dating program, which is very, very interesting, is Catfish by Neve Schulman. Now, that was a feature-length documentary. I remember watching that many years ago. And, of course, Neve and his grey-haired friend, whose name escapes me right now, they were contracted to make 30-minute Catfish episodes, and I've watched most of those. They're very, very formulaic and well-constructed. But I would say that Sweet Bobby absolutely could have easily been a 30-minute Catfish episode for MTV. It, in my opinion, my only opinion that's personal obviously, is that Sweet Bobby is a pathetic exploitation of a real human being who has already been exploited. So the lady at the centre of it, she falls in love with this person, gets strung along. It's happened to many people in history. It's not really that unusual. And we find out in the end that it's actually her cousin, who is a female, who has set her up in that way. And we don't know why. And there is injustice because the person who did that is not prosecuted, or they don't seem to pay any penance. Often they don't on Catfish either. They don't come to terms with it. They don't take responsibility. However, the pace and the phrasing of Sweet Bobby is at times excruciating. Perhaps that's just me. I'm very impatient. But there was one episode where the protagonist, narrator, the victim, is explaining whether she's going to turn left at a roundabout or go right at a roundabout. And she literally spends about 5 minutes deciding this. And it is just like padding and waffle, and it's no good. It's no good at all. As I say, tortoise, pull your freaking head in. What are you doing? What are you doing creating such a junky piece of trash? So one of those good pieces of writing that is on the Tortoise website is called What We Are For, and it's an essay written by James Hardy, who is the co-founder and editor. Now, in terms of the writing, it is very engaging. It has technical brilliance in terms of the phraseology, the sentence structure. It just reads beautifully. It's sassy, the voice is really consistent, uses really effective metaphors, and is very convincing overall on first glance. He is a far better writer than Alexi MONSTROUS, but I see through the marketing, I suppose, or the spiel. And I would say that whilst they say they're the type of media outlet that doesn't follow crash victims or attend press conferences, they don't sensationalise things, but instead unpacks current affairs in depth and detail, and that they try to put forward a radical optimism. This is not true. This is false. They do not extend radical optimism to Ella Gariva or Abe, or most concerningly, the children at the centre. 2 children are not given radical optimism. And in this piece, shamefully, I think, Hardy sort of expresses their collective desire to minimise the gap between the powerful and the powerless, which they claim is widening. They are lying in this because, in fact, what they seem to want to do is allow the powerful perpetrators, potential perpetrators, alleged perpetrators, a free pass, and they want to penalise the victims. They express this feeling of being locked out of democracy and discussion. No doubt there is this feeling in society. I feel that very keenly, and it makes me want to cry and it makes me want to roar. But these people are not locked out of democracy. They are controlling democracy, and they are certainly not locked out of the conversation. They are influencing the conversation. They are perpetuating the conversation and its direction. So there's a lack of authenticity here. It's deceptive. They are not a powerless, marginalised startup media company. Give us a break, but they're trying to position themselves as that. Hardy, and MONSTROUS, more MONSTROUS. Let me speak about MONSTROUS. He is very much somebody who sides with the powerful. He tells us that he was approached by one of the families of the potential victims, child victims, and that is where his skill no doubt lies, in the courtroom. So there are potentially 175 people at the school who have in some way been victim, and yet this man sides with, the socially powerful, and believes in, to some degree it seems, in protecting potential perpetrators of SRCA for whatever reason. Excuse me as I have a little sip of my coffee. So back to MONSTROUS, and my distaste for this whole series is that he uses the podcast form, I think, to re-victimize victims. This is not right. It's monstrous. It's monstrous as a media person to use your form to go and interrogate, undermine, confuse, rattle victims, potential victims, alleged victims of child sexual abuse, satanic ritual abuse. It's not right, it's monstrous. Now, as I've said, I am happy to speak to MONSTROUS at any time. I'm on holidays at the moment. I've got time for you, MONSTROUS. Let's keep going. In my not so humble opinion, Hoaxed aims at the appearance of objectivity, but is really biased. It's persuasive and it is very, very false. I'm wondering if there are other people out there who also find Monstrous's work as transparent as I do. Now I can see that Abe has commented on my preview video. Thank you very much for doing that, Abe. We are here to support you and Ella, and everything you've been through is just testament to your character, that you're out and you're doing your thing. We are here for you. So there were many times where I had to suppress my absurd laughter so that I didn't look insane. It's so very translucent at times. Sometimes it's just ridiculous. Anyway, on to the next dot point. I am really excited to almost get into the guts of the deconstruction of Hoaxed. If you haven't listened to it yet, please do. Go to Apple Podcasts and download it. There are 6 episodes. You'll hear my good friend Arthur Katow, in the last episode. He makes an appearance. And you'll hear Monstrous, and maybe you'll preempt what I'm going to say about it by thinking critically as you listen to it. We will be analysing the text. We're going to look at how it's been constructed. Who does it serve? We'll look at the constructedness of these texts as well. And we'll acknowledge what I think is, in my opinion, very apt, and that is that this is a deliberate use of money from guns, money from bad stuff, money from dividing and conquering people, all that stuff, all that 1% ruling elite stuff where we know what they do with that money. But I think that money is being used here to, what would you call it, quell the anti-government sentiment that is really rife at the moment. So we are going to pull these texts apart and the surrounding texts as well. And we will do that in detail. That's what we do in language and literature. This man, Monstrous, seems to think everybody's an idiot, and that he can very easily manipulate us all. And we need to show that we're not easy to manipulate, that we connect these dots, we can see this stuff. So that's the end. It's over 20 minutes. I'm going to sign off now. Please note that episode 4 is entitled Post-Publication. It will be launched, I don't know, sooner or later. And its subtitle will be Factualizing Fiction. Because, of course, in this post-truth era, it's actually very difficult to figure out what is real and what is not. I do apologise for my technical issues. I need to get on top of the Apple and make sure it works. And the PowerPoint keynote presentation I will upload somewhere, not too sure where that will go. And so look forward to seeing you again next time we're up there, which I think from memory is about 2 weeks before we go back to work. Please get involved in the conversation. Subscribe, like, get the notifications, and engage in a conversation. We need to get this message out. We need to get this message out. Goodbye and good luck. Do get in touch should you need to. Should you have any information, email me. You can do it anonymously. You can speak to me on the phone. Leave your contact details and tell me what's the best way to get you. And I look forward to being in somebody's house in the next day or two as I put in a whole lot of overtime or payback time for my, what would you call it? I don't know. I'm going to sign off. I'm starting to babble junk now, and Satan's choir is up, as the drug addicts say. The birds are out and they're chirping and I need to go to bed. Episode 4 coming soon. Bye.